Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening or good night or good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are located right now. This is Gabriel Fernandez Borsat. I'm Alef Trust Applied Program Leader. I manage the overall coordination of Alef Trust certificate programs, and I'm core faculty of our MSc program in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology. We're here today for an open house session with Dr. Emma Bragdon. At the Alef Trust, we're very glad that Emma has chosen us to offer his 3 hour workshops and 7 week courses in partnership with us. She's a world authority on recognizing and supporting people in spiritual awakening and spiritual crisis. She's a pioneer in this field with more than 45 years of experience, accompanying spiritual seekers and consciousness explorers in their challenging transformative experiences, and has trained more than 140 spiritual emergence coaches. She authored 2 classic books on the subject with 5 other on similar themes, and she is the executive director of Integrative Mental Health University. Next, Emma will present his work and the 7 week course on how to effectively support people in spiritual awakening and spiritual crisis, which will start in mid-April. And she will also present the 3 hour workshop she's offering in 2 weeks. And after that, there will be time for questions from attendees. You can pose your questions in the chat during the session, and I will moderate the Q&A period. Now and during the session, feel free to open your webcams if you want. This way, your experience will be more similar to how the course webinars are, but be aware that this session is being recorded and you may appear in the recording. So thanks, Emma, for offering your courses and your knowledge and your wisdom with us, and I hand over to you.
My pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be sponsored by the Alef Trust and working with the Alef Trust. As you all may know, I live in Vermont, USA, and I'm delighted to be having more of international collaboration. So I'm going to switch the view now to the speaker view so that we can also go to some slides I've prepared. Forgive me for a moment. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. Okay. All right. So today, during this open house, I'll be talking a little bit about spiritual awakening and spiritual crisis. I'll just go now to an agenda so you understand the flow of events. I'll speak a little bit more about who I am and the definitions of this territory of spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, and spiritual crisis. We'll go over a little bit of around the categories and the catalysts for spiritual awakening. An important aspect of this exploration of the territory is to look at how conventional psychology and psychiatry is looking at or not looking at spiritual awakening phenomena, and then go into a little bit about the need for some education, especially around caring for someone in a spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis. And I'll give you some details on opportunities for further learning and my contact info, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. So just so you understand, the abbreviation SE is what I use for spiritual emergence, or also known as spiritual awakening, and SEY is spiritual emergency, also known as spiritual crisis. So a little bit more about me. I did graduate from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in 1987, and I have, especially since that time of writing my PhD, specialized in this area of spiritual crises vis-a-vis mental health. What is the relationship, and how can we help people in spiritual crisis? In 2013, I founded Integrative Mental Health University, IMHU, and I now have a co-executive director, Andy Johns. I have been teaching since 1990, and from 2001 until the present day, I've done extensive research in Brazil because I think they have developed a program that assists people who are in spiritual awakening or spiritual emergency that goes, and it is far more effective than anything we have developed here in our paradigm of care, both in the UK and the United States. I have authored 7 books and I have produced a couple of films, co-produced, and I have experienced all the categories of awakening. On a personal level, I'm a mother, a grandmother, and aspire to be an elder. So, just a little bit more about the books. This on the upper left-hand corner, you see a source book for helping people with spiritual problems. That used to be called a source book for helping people in spiritual emergency, but I retitled it in the latest edition so that it would be similar to what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders has in their book on categories of mental disturbance that might show up in someone's office. Spiritual problems is named, but the call of spiritual emergency, which is more to the center of your screen, is a book I was asked to write by a major publisher, which goes in much more into narratives on what are people experiencing who are in a spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency, and what is the outcome. That's been very important to a lot of people. So that you understand more about where I've been also in Brazil, the book Kardec Spiritism is kind of a primer on a particular subgroup, which has done such magnificent work with spiritual emergency. And Spiritism and mental health is much more academic and brings together a lot of the Spiritist psychiatrists and Spiritist practitioners in Brazil to write chapters on what their contributions are to mental health care. And then on the bottom right is the cover of a documentary film on Spiritism. So if you're interested in learning more about these, you can go to imhu.org/store and get information and links for purchasing. So to go on now to definitions, spiritual experiences might be called a lot of different things in different languages, in different cultures, and specifically also in spiritual groups versus maybe in religious groups. So I'm going to suggest to you how I look at it, and so we can have some kind of connection during our time together. So I think of spiritual experiences as being those that come from a higher perspective. A teacher that I think highly of, Yogananda, says they all come from the intuition or the sixth sense. So literally beyond the five senses, and they open and expand the sixth sense. So these experiences take us beyond social conditioning, beyond our five senses, and beyond the ego. So some examples, visions of a greater reality, including one's future. So typically we think that's totally impossible, but there are some people who, of all ages, young children as well as people in adulthood and beyond, who have a very, very distinct visions of how their life will unfold and what will be happening in their life. Very unusual experience. Sometimes people get that vision also with communication from their higher power, or who they may describe as their higher power or their higher self, or directly with spirit guides who are invisible to most people, but may in fact be heard from by people who have this sixth sense developed to the point where they are actually communicating with spirit guides who always are holding them in a positive regard and giving them positive messages about themselves and about their future. Then Other examples, specific sensing of others' realities. So in order to have that kind of sensing, one will also be feeling a kind of connectedness, possibly with all people or possibly with animals, possibly with nature. And it can lead for some people with a sense of oneness with all of life. Another example, profound inspiration manifesting through poetry, music, also through technology and extraordinary things that are happening right now in the realm of technology. So, one thing to remember is that these kinds of experiences can occur at any time. In other words, at any age, and they may come through spiritual practices aimed at expanding consciousness and they may also come through the use of psychedelics and plant medicines, not just meditation, yoga, and prayer, etc. By the way, if you have questions as I'm going through this, please use the chat box and I will go back to it at the end of the presentation. So just feel free to use the chat box. So going on with definitions, uh, what is this thing we call awakening? And again, it has been described in many different ways and oftentimes different depending on a culture. I'm going to lump that into also the notion of spiritual emergence. In other words, a process that people will go through, possibly taking a lifetime. And if someone goes through that process all the way to the ultimate end, which is rare, one reaches a state which has been called enlightenment in the Far East or self-realization. And it's of great interest to me and possibly to you too that at this point, 41% of adults in the United States have experienced a spiritual awakening. And the numbers are getting higher and higher. I've seen it up to 65% recently in research, but it's a measure that more people are feeling comfortable talking about their spiritual awakening experiences. Previously, the phenomena connected to spiritual awakening has been considered actually as a symptom of mental illness. So people have been very reluctant to share about their experiences. That's changing. And in fact, interest in awakening and how a person can stimulate awakening is certainly growing by leaps and bounds right now across the world. So the awakening process does involve identifying with the higher self, sometimes called the wisdom self, sometimes called the soul, but it is an identification with the deeper or higher, depending on how you look at it, aspect of ourself rather than the ego there's basically a construct. The ego is a construct made up of beliefs we have about ourselves. So it involves generally a profound psychospiritual transformation, moving from a sense of ego to identification with the soul. And along with that transformation will come new values, beliefs, and priorities. So, what then is a spiritual crisis, also called spiritual emergency? So, if someone is experiencing these phenomena connected to awakening, they may become quite disoriented or in distress. And that can become so intense that it can be literally debilitating to the point where someone finds it not only distasteful, but impossible to go to work or attend to the kind of duties of house maintenance or childcare that are usually typical for them. So that in itself can be overwhelming. But another thing that can happen in a spiritual crisis is the effects of previous trauma that have not been totally metabolized can enter into consciousness and can overwhelm a person. So that means a person can flip sequentially from strong spiritual experiences into the emotions of previous trauma, or they can even be happening simultaneously. And you can get a sense of how overwhelming that might be, especially if there was strong trauma. But if someone is given appropriate support, the outcome is then human flourishing. And the way I would define human flourishing is there's greater peace, much more acceptance of a person just as they are, which will also be the ground for them being able to accept other people as they are, creating deeper connections with certainly with other people and animals and all of life.
My favorite song. It's like,
Yeah, and I don't know whose voice that was, but would you kindly mute
I have
yourself?
closed the microphone of this person. Don't worry, Emma.
Thank you. So now I'm going to shift into an example of a category. We usually think of there being 13 categories that will define ways in which these spiritual experiences will manifest and the phenomena associated with each one. It would take me at least an hour or so or more to describe all 13. And that's something that I do in the longer course, but I'll go into one category which seems to be happening more and more spontaneously even to people. So let's call it a psychic opening, which involves an opening in perceptual fields. We can associate it with the sixth sense, which is what I went over a couple slides ago, but also the third eye, which is between the two eyebrows. And as someone opens that third eye, which is not physical, but it is a manifestation of strong intuition, they start opening to subtle perceptions. In other words, being able to perceive energies, sometimes being able to perceive energies that are emanating from the body. We can call out the aura, or energies within the body having to do with how energy is moving through the body. But it also can involve channeling spirit guides. It can involve clairvoyance, in other words, being able to perceive things that are not material, but are of a subtle nature. For instance, clairvoyance might be perceiving someone who has passed away, but perceiving them in spirit form. Clairaudience has to do with perceiving the communications that may be coming in a subtle level. In other words, most people who are more materially oriented cannot hear the voice, but the person who is clairaudient might hear the voice either in their head or in their heart or just in some particular arena where they can get literally a message. Clairsentience has to do with being able to feel, for instance, being able to sense what feelings other people are having without that person letting them know, either by gestures or words, how they're feeling, and possibly even being outside of the person's visual ken. In other words, that might be in another part of the house or another part of the city or another country, even. And yet, a person who is clairsentient might just be given their name and be able to feel what that person is feeling and possibly even diagnose them for any kind of mental or physical illness. So, in the same way, there can be a subtle ability to pick up something that we might associate with tasting or smelling. For instance, a friend of mine who's a geomancer and very connected to the earth and highly sensitive can go into a place that has a very high vibration, meaning they're very positive things that have happened there, and she'll smell roses, even though there are no roses present. She'll say the place smells like roses. And you may have had the experience of going into a place where there are some negative things happening and and have a sense, oh, this place leaves a bad taste in my mouth. So it's not that you've eaten anything there or tasted anything there, but that's just that the sense comes through to you in that way. But when a person is opening in this particular way to their having a psychic opening, it can be frightening, especially when the perceptual abilities have been repressed by one's family or one's culture and therefore seem unacceptable. So a woman who has been a student of mine was in a situation when she was 19 years old where her parents were very highly educated, and she had only knowledge of really what was materially available to her to see, to to hear, to smell, etc. And suddenly, she all of her subtle perceptual abilities opened up as a result of someone slipping something into her drink, and they continued on for days and days and days. So she had this psychic opening and had absolutely no orientation, no conceptual framework for it, no way of managing it, and it was extremely debilitating for her. She thought, of course, that she was going crazy. Why was she hearing things? Why was she seeing things that other people weren't seeing? The positive note is that she's become a student of IMHU and is now in a position helping others who are having similar experiences. So she got the help that she needed. But it can be extremely frightening if someone lives in a culture or lives in a family where there's absolutely no recognition of these kinds of abilities being present or the possibility of them. So some of you may have had that experience. Now, one of the things that can happen as a result of psychic opening is that someone can open up to what has been called in several traditions a mystical experience. One of the teachers that I follow calls it Christ consciousness, although it is not connected to Christianity in itself. It is only connected to an experience one can have where there's a feeling of union with love itself. Many people associate that with Christ, but that is also associated with other fine wisdom keepers. The other thing that we experience through this mystical experience can be an intuitive felt sense of being one with all living beings. And it can lead to, in other words, if you experience it, it can lead to increased wisdom, increased compassion, and increased being in service. That's actually a hallmark of those people who have received sufficient assistance and support, is that they have after these kinds of openings, they have a deep desire to be in service to others who are in their awakening process. So again, in the longer courses, I go into describing what is catalyzing these kinds of awakenings around the world right now, especially right now. But for today, I'm just going to briefly go over one catalyst out of the 10. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Elaine Aron. She's a clinical psychologist who did some of the primary research on highly sensitive persons. So there is a book that she wrote, which is highlighted here on the right, and also a film, which is about her and about highly sensitive people. And what she has found is that 20% of all people in all cultures, and men and women in the same proportion, are highly sensitive persons or HSP. And so they can they're can also be identified even in the womb. And the qualities that these people have is that they are prone to process life at a very deep level. These are the children who ask, "What is death? Where do I go after death? I want to know more about that," and will ask insistently before they get an answer that's okay with them. They also have a sense of being overstimulated very easily. So going to a large stadium with thousands of people who are watching a big football game, let's say, and there's lots of loud music and people shouting, would not be a place where a child or even an adult who's HSP would feel comfortable. Big box stores also included are not the favorite place for an HSP. HSP people tend to be highly empathic, so they would be prone to feeling what other people are feeling, being sensitive to other people's feelings, but also possibly being able to develop that into being healers. And they are more prone to sense subtleties. Now, Dr. Elaine Aron herself did not go into the spiritual experiences that people are having who are HSP until this month. And this month, she's launching another book on spirituality and HSP. So I'm excited to hear more about it. But being a highly sensitive person can bring a person into the zone where they're more likely to have these spiritual experiences and be in a spiritual emergence process. Another catalyst I wanted to mention is that we are, from the point of view of different cultures, we're going into a different kind of age than we've been in before. And from the yogic philosophy tradition, we are going into Kali Yuga. So there is within the yogic tradition, and this goes back thousands of years, there is a 24,000 year cycle of the yugas or ages. And at this particular point, we are transitioning out of the darkest age or Kali Yuga. And in Kali Yuga, people have lost touch with higher spiritual truth and subtle perceptions. And so in the Kali Yuga, what can be measured by the five senses is real, but nothing else is real. A lot of us have been educated from that particular perspective. But here we are in transition into the Dwapara Yuga, where it's much more possible for people to have things like psychic openings, to spontaneously, in other words, without any kind of prodding or without any kind of stimulus, move into a zone where they're channeling or having mental telepathy or actually moving into some form of mediumship. And what's recognized in the Dwapara Yuga is energy is more primary than material reality. So that's a huge, huge change in orientation. Even though Einstein spoke about it over 100 years ago, we haven't caught up with Einstein, and we're still quite lost in Kali Yuga or lost on the bridge between Kali Yuga and Dwapara Yuga. But spontaneous awakenings can happen in Dwapara Yuga, excuse me, in the Dwapara Yuga, without any kind of practice or even without the stimulation that can come from plant medicines or psychedelics. So if you would just take a moment and notice for yourself, and if you would like, I would love for you to share in the chat box if you feel like doing so, because sharing about this can be challenging because people are used to holding it quite privately. But we can all become more educated by learning from each other how these kinds of experiences manifest. And you might just ask yourself the three questions that are on your screen right now. Have you recently had any unusual or profound experiences that felt spiritual or otherworldly in nature? Have you been experiencing intense emotions or thoughts that seem to be related to spiritual or existential questions? And are you finding it difficult to reconcile your spiritual experiences with your current beliefs, values, or life circumstances? So you might be just thinking yes or no as your answer, but you also might have something come to mind that you'd like to share, and please do so in the chat box if you'd like to. So no obligation, but it can always help us to understand this territory more when we exchange more about our own personal experience. Again, in the longer courses that I teach, I do much more on the screening tool. These are only 3 questions that are involved in screening. And my intention with the longer course is to create and give you a screening tool that can be used actually with clients or with yourself or with a loved one in terms of opening up the conversation about spiritual awakening, spiritual experiences, spiritual emergence, and also helping someone to realize that it can be a very normal experience. Bringing normalcy to this area can be a huge transition that can be extremely helpful for people. So I'm going to move on now to what conventional psychology and psychiatry offers. Some of you may be familiar with what's called the DSM, which is pictured here graphically. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which some people even think of as the Bible of categories of mental illness, or the dictionary that is referred to, especially in the United States, but it's also used in other cultures throughout the world. You may be also more familiar with the ICD-11, which is your book of categories, most often used in the UK. But in terms of um, both the DSM and the ICD, at this point, we're looking at religious and spiritual experiences from the point of view of the editors of these fine books. We're looking at from the point of view only of culture. In other words, culture includes language, religion and spirituality, family structures, life cycle, stages, ceremonial rituals and customs, as well as moral and legal systems. So the spiritual problems that may come about from the point of view of these books, they are relegated to culture. And basically, the books are saying, yes, religion and spiritual experiences can impact or color a pathology, but are not in themselves indicative of pathology. In other words, if you're having a spiritual experience, that doesn't mean you're crazy. However, there's an inconsistency here because spiritual experiences are not described. And instead, what is suggested but not mandated is something called the cultural formation interview, which can evoke from people whether they are having spiritual experiences or not. But since this is not mandated, and since that is not described what a spiritual experience is, it leaves open the door for a lot of misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatments because people lack training and they also lack guidance in even identifying the phenomena of spiritual awakening and certainly some of the complexities of a spiritual crisis. Hmm. At this particular point, as of last fall, September, I think it was, uh, the designation now adds moral problem along with religious or spiritual problem. So the door is opening a little bit more to include some of the spiritual issues that may come to a person's attention, let's say a clinician who is looking to support someone. And again, it is considered not indicative of a mental illness. However, just to summarize and reiterate, there's no definitive resource on the experiences and phenomena which the various religions, spiritual traditions, and cultural contexts consider as normal, expected, desirable, or pathological. So here we are in this situation without such a resource. How can we expect our mental health care workers and all of our healthcare workers to adequately respond to understand the phenomena of spiritual awakening and correctly differentiate them from pathology. There is inadequate training for healthcare providers. So, providers, from my point of view, need to become competent in diagnosis and treatment of spiritual issues related to all of the spiritual experiences. And by doing so, they can support human flourishing. Now, without gaining competency in that particular area, it could be that our finest healthcare providers are missing the boat. In other words, if appropriate support for spiritual awakening can bring a person into human flourishing, then we absolutely need our healthcare providers to acknowledge what a spiritual awakening process is about and learn how to support it. So, one of the issues may be, and several people are bringing this out, that it would be important for healthcare providers to have some personal experience as well as training. Because without personal experience of, for instance, expanded states of consciousness, it's so much easier to discount spiritual experiences as a hallucination, for instance, or dissociation, or something else indicative of mental illness. And there would be no treasuring of the awakening process as being a pathway into human flourishing. So, where can a person go to get help and support becomes the question. If they can't go to our regular primary care physicians or mental health care workers. And what is our society missing out on when there is not sufficient support for human flourishing? You might put your answer to that question in the chat box if you would like to. What are we missing out on when there's insufficient support for human flourishing? So, one of the things that we're trying to do through the organization that I run is to recognize that this whole arena is a missing piece in training of healthcare providers. And at this particular point, we cannot expect the providers to recognize or understand the spiritual awakening phenomenon or phenomena. And also, given that most of us are steeped in the prior age and don't understand the subtle energies, most of the public also has had no introduction to spiritual emergence, awakening, and spiritual crisis. So, in other words, misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment, usually over-relying on psychiatric medication, happens frequently and can lead to more trauma. So, for those of you who are looking for resources, one resource for finding someone who can be helpful in terms of integrating a spiritual emergence process are the spiritual emergence coaches that I've trained, and they are in an international directory, about 140 of them, and the URL for them is in that pink box on your right. There are opportunities for more training at Alef Trust, like the ones that I'll be giving in the near future in April, a 3-hour course as well as a 7-week course, and also at Integrative Mental Health University. Okay, so we're moving now into just some opportunities for future learning. If you want to acquire more understanding and practical skills, not only to help someone else, like a client, but also to better understand maybe what you've been through in the past or what you're going through now, or to understand your partner or someone in your family who may be going through this. All of those intentions are very much welcomed, and we speak to them in the course, the 7-week course given through Alef Trust, How to Effectively Support People in Spiritual Awakening and spiritual crisis. So the next iteration of that course will be on Tuesday evenings, April 14th to May 26th, online only. But we're also offering a 3-hour workshop, which will be on April 7th, also online, and 6 to 9 p.m. in the UK, 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard in the United States. And if you go to the 3-hour workshop, you will get different information than in the 7-week course. And whatever you pay for that 3-hour workshop will be credited towards the 7-week course.
It's 80 pounds, 80 British pounds, the cost of the 3-hour workshop. And
Thank
they
you very much,
and they
Gabriel.
can reuse it in full for the 7-week course, right?
That's great. Thank you. So, what is in this? What do you learn? Uh, we're really looking at delving more deeply into the positive transformative outcomes of a spiritual crisis when it is supported adequately. And then, of course, we're looking at models to manage it appropriately so that the most positive outcome can happen. That will, of course, entail people learning how to improve the way they offer support, understand how the awakening phenomena may arise, going over all 13 categories, and also recognizing how frequently this awakening process is happening by articulating what the catalysts are at this particular time for awakening processes. In all, in sum, becoming more competent in assessment and management. And for those of you who are highly motivated and want to become spiritual emergence coaches in order to help others and be listed as a spiritual emergence coach in our directory, this 7-week course is actually a prerequisite to a 2-day workshop offered in London, September 12th and 13th. And you can learn more about it at imhu.org. And also, I'll give the direct URL in one of the next slides. So the materials that we offer during the 7-week course are more on the screening tool. I just gave you a little taste of it a little while ago. And then a practical chart to help you differentiate between spiritual crisis and pathology, which is obviously of the essence. It's the heart of the difficulties that are happening now within our mental health care system. There's a practical summary of care that brings together the main points of the whole course and that can be used in a clinical setting. There are guided self-reflections to help you understand what your process has been, and so you'll be more ready to help other people because you've articulated your own process for yourself. We look at the transcultural aspect of this. In other words, what have other cultures done to successfully support awakening? And what kind of ways do they describe this particular process? You'll have opportunities to network and discuss with other students. And there will be video interviews with those who've experienced these crises and resolved them well. Also, a lot of additional resources for reading and viewing, and quizzes to reinforce learning. So, a lot of people are asking where it's online and the time needed. Each session we put aside an hour and a half so that there's plenty of time for live Q&A after each presentation. And I do give the presentations live. You may be drawn to spending 45 minutes more each week with the adjacent materials, but that's a matter of choice. Who is this for? Well, we put out the welcome mat to everyone, people with lived experience, those that care for them, but also counselors, healthcare providers, because the healthcare providers will get the opportunity to incorporate tools and practices from the program in ways that will benefit their clients or patients. And on completion, you earn a professional certificate from the Alef Trust. So my contact information, eb@imhu.org. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And if you want to know more about Integrative Mental Health University, we do have a number of courses that might be of interest to you because we're really very specifically dealing with supporting spiritual awakening as well as helping people in spiritual emergency. If you are interested in moving forward with certification as a spiritual emergence coach, you do have to take either the 7-week course at Alef Trust or a similar course given at IMHU in order to fulfill the prerequisite before you take the practicum. And the URL for the practicum is listed here, so please feel free to take a photograph of it. And I think, Gabriel, tell me if I'm wrong, but people will have access to these slides and the presentation uh, if they've registered for this um, open house. Is that correct? You're muted, Gabriel.
Yes, yes, we will send them when we send them the email with the link to the recording.
Okay, great. So they'll have a chance to look at the slides again. And there are references as well here if you're interested in reading on further. So again, you will have a copy of all of this coming to you, and you can follow through with some more reading if you want. And I'm going to stop share and come back and see if there are any questions that you have. Okay, where's my chat box? Here we go. So I don't see a lot in the chat box right now. I see a wonderful yes from Carrie. And Owana says, I'm an HSP who used to rely solely on being rational, but now I feel there's something more there. Feeling very disoriented, not sure how to move forward in my life. Thank you very much for sharing, Owana. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Forgive me. But that can be a very difficult situation to be in, especially if you're feeling disoriented. And one of the things that can be most helpful in terms of moving forward in your life is connecting with other people who've had this experience and been able to integrate this kind of experience and being HSP and have found a way to stay grounded and be able to function in what is called normal life and also be able to completely respect and work with whatever gifts you've been given as HSP. Does that make sense? I see a thumbs up. Okay, I'll take that as yes. Annette is asking, would this description of emergence then say that all crisis eliminates the diagnosis of pathology? Kind of answered this. I would say no to that, Annette. Thank you for the question. That's an important question. But I, um, well, maybe I should start by retracting what I just said. Maybe if we take the perspective that all of life, everything that happens in life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the everything, and say that it all contributes to be an opportunity for us to grow psychologically and spiritually, then there's no diagnosis and there's no pathology. But I think in terms of functioning, like can a person function? As an adult, can they support themselves? And can they live in a way where they are compassionate and supportive in their relationships? There are clearly some people who enter into some kind of a crisis, and it may be a crisis because they have a lot of animosity. They've experienced severe trauma in their early life, and they have a lot of animosity towards other people. This is just one example. But such a person may need a diagnosis, and maybe diagnosis is too much of a biomedical term. Maybe what we can say is, oh, there's a marker that this particular person may have had very difficult trauma early in life, and they need some compassionate care and nurturing so that they can move beyond their antipathy to other people. So that's just one example. But I think it's extremely important to recognize that I'm certainly not talking about throwing away everything that we do in mental health care. It's really, from my point of view, I'm not anti-psychiatry. I'm not anti-psychiatric medication. Both psychiatry and medication have their benefits and the right place, but over relying on them, in other words, over relying on giving someone a diagnostic category or giving them medication when actually they're having a spiritual awakenings is inappropriate. And that's what I'm trying to communicate, not only in this open house, but in the other courses as well. Does that make sense? Annette, feel free to speak if you want, or write a message. And if anyone else has any questions or comments about what I've presented today, please feel free to use the chat box. And I'd also specifically love to hear just where you're located. Are you in the UK? Are you in the United States? Where are you sitting right now? What's your location? Lisa is wondering, have or considered creating with the Functional Medicine Institute in the United States. So, Lisa, I think very, very highly of the people who are doing functional medicine. And I also took the blood test that was offered through the functional health. So I'm personally integrated with it. And if I were to become ill, that would be the first place I would go because they look at a systems approach. However, I have not seen them specifically speaking about spiritual awakening, the phenomena of awakening, or the crises that people have. And so I haven't reached out to them specifically. I'm reaching out more to those people who have already stated their interest in this particular field. And fortunately, there are more and more people who are. So, in terms of where you are, California until April, then Canada, Austin, Texas, a soggy northeast of England, UK. Okay, so it's split evenly between the United States and the UK, it looks like. Great. Well, that I'm delighted that you all are here. Any other questions or thoughts relative to what's been presented today? And I'm totally okay about being challenged as well. So feel free if you want to challenge me about anything that was said or not said.
By the way, just in case, I'm sharing in the chat right now the links to the courses you offer in our website, so they have all the information there.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Is there anything, Gabriel, that you'd like to ask the people who are here today?
No, not exactly. I think that they have the information. They will receive an email with a link to the recording so they can rewatch this open house, and they can contact us with any question or doubt they have. Yeah.
Okay, super. All right. Well, let me see. Hmm. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else. Grateful for the opportunity. Thank you, Lisa. All right. So I will put us on gallery view for a moment, just so I can say thank you to you all. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for your questions and your interest. And may you all be well. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.